Growing plants is getting harder, more expensive, more complex, increasingly more difficult. I'm Chad Masura, CEO and founder of Rosy, and this is How We Grow. Hello, and welcome back to How We Grow. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Andrew McGowan, a soil scientist, agronomist, and most importantly, a member of Rosy Soil Advisory Board. Andrew has earned his PhD in agronomy from Kansas State University and now works at Terradot, where he leads R&D field trials and commercial deployments focused on enhanced rock weathering and carbon removal. But more broadly, Andrew has spent his career studying how soils actually function in the real world, how we measure them, and why translating soil science into practical grower decisions is often much harder than it sounds. In this conversation, we'll break down what soil is actually doing beneath the surface, where growers tend to overcomplicate or oversimplify things, how to think about soil data and new amendments critically, and what separates real agronomic value from hype. And then I'm sure we'll have a bunch of fun random side quests along the way. But we'll also dive into enhanced rock weathering, carbon removal, and where Andrew sees genuine opportunity for the future of agriculture and soil health. So with that, Andrew, I'm super excited to have you on today. Thanks so much for your time. And looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, likewise, Chad. Excited to be here.
Great. So just to dive into it, for people who are not soil scientists, right? Like, how do you explain, at a very high level, what soil actually is, and perhaps why it matters so much more than, say, some growers might realize?
Yeah, I feel like, a lot of people, it's easy to forget about soil. We walk on top of it every day. It's all around us. But it's, not grabbing our attention the same way that, say, plants do or other things that are happening above the ground. But it's really a complex living system. A teaspoon of soil, contains more organisms than an amount of people on Earth. Importantly, it provides a ton of really important agronomic and ecosystem services, supporting plant growth with water, nutrients. It's a major reservoir for carbon that helps regulate the climate, habitat for biodiversity. The list goes on and on. And it's really delicate. It's a mix of organic matter, minerals that may have come from a number of different origins. It's got water and air in it, and it takes a really long time to form. The back of the envelope rule is that it takes maybe 500 to 1,000 years for an inch of soil to form. So it's really important. It doesn't jump up in our face the way other things do, but it has a huge impact on our lives, especially, of course, if you're in farming and agriculture.
Yeah, great. And so what originally pulled you into this soil science world? Like, was there a moment or a project that, kind of first got you excited about this work?
I think I had leanings towards soil science before I even knew that it was a discipline or what I wanted to do. Like when I was maybe like 5 or 6, I did like to go out in our backyard and just dig holes. And it like really big holes where my parents got concerned about pets like falling in them and stuff. But that gave me like an early on really hands-on experience, just seeing a soil profile before I even knew what that was. And so I think when I found out that it was an area of study, when I was trying to pick out what I wanted to do for my undergrad, I already had these experiences to kind of associate with that. And then
that you could dig holes for a living, basically.
yeah, exactly. In the agronomy program at Kansas State University is really, really awesome. And they really welcomed me in, not coming from a traditional ag background. And the Intro to Soils class from kind of iconic professor, Dr. Stephen Teen, who also taught my dad soils when he was an undergrad, really does a good job giving you the crash course on all the different components of soil. And then I also had this really cool opportunity to be on the soil judging team at Kansas State, where you actually have a competition where you travel to different parts of the country and try to identify what types of soils they have there. And that was like another really great hands-on experience that also gives an appreciation for how diverse soils are and how they fit into the landscape and interact with um, both the landscape and the vegetation and also like the management that's happening in the area. So I think that kind of confluence of really good academic teaching with a lot of hands-on experiences really got me hooked.
Yeah. Okay. So I need to hear more about the soil judging competition. Like, what was that actually in practice? What did that look like?
So there'd be a team that would host in the region that you're going to, and they would go around ahead of time and dig a bunch of pits with an excavator. And some of these, you would be like the soil's like up over your head. They would be, maybe like 1 to 1.5 meters deep, so that you could see a whole cross section of soil. Usually there were also Natural Resource Conservation Service staff there. And one of the groups within that agency, their main job is actually mapping all of the soils in the US. It's this really great digital resource that we have where you can actually look up for any area of the country, what type of soil that is underneath you. Behind that is like a whole classification system, kind of similar to the way that in biology you learn about classifying plants and animals, with kingdom, phylum, order, etc. A system like that exists for soils. So with the soil judging competition, what we do is we'd go and we'd learn about the soils. They would teach us about the different types they had there. You would learn like what they looked like, some of their unique characteristics, how to characterize them out in the field, like assign color codes. You would make texture balls and try to figure out, how much sand, how much clay and silt is in there. And then based off of all that information, try to identify what type of soil is this. And then the competition is to see who can do that most accurately.
And were you any good?
I wasn't the best. I did well at some, but yeah, while I was at K-State and also afterwards, they won Kansas State won the national championship several times. So the team collectively was quite good. And a lot of that was because we had an amazing coach, Mickey Ransom, who had worked for the NRCS and did a really good job teaching us about the soils and all the different areas we went to.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, cool. So yeah, let's fast forward a little bit. So you've worked across, research, ag tech, field trials, now carbon removal. I mean, you've seen so many different aspects and facets of this industry. I'm curious, like when you walk into a new field or a new greenhouse or a new growing operation, like what are some of the first things that you pay attention to?
Yeah, so most of the time I'm working in outdoor systems in mineral soils, a lot of row crop agriculture, and yeah, with a lot of the jobs that I've had, I'll be like flying in from somewhere else because we will have projects all over the place. Like at Terradot, a lot of the work's even been in Brazil. So sometimes I'm not super familiar with the areas or the agriculture when I'm going in. And the things that I like to check to quickly get context, one, if there are soil maps available ahead of time and I know where I'm going, I love to take a look at those because you can learn about how the dominant soils in the area formed, what their texture is, their technical classification ahead of time. And then that makes it easier to get up to speed when you're actually out in the field. Once I'm out in the field, I mean, it's hard to beat digging a hole. It's still one of my favorite things to do. And take a look at the soil, and I'll look for things like what is the color that can tell you a lot about the mineralogy and how much organic matter is there, and maybe what the nutrient cycling potential of the soil is. You can also get clues on like if there are drainage issues and things like that might be limiting for crop growth. You can look at the soil, basically the soil structure. So like how is the soil kind of like clumping together into aggregates? And are there aggregates or is it more massive structure or are there like plates that are kind of indicative of a compacted soil, where maybe roots are going to have a hard time growing. So just from digging a hole, you can like look at a lot of these things and just, kind of gauge roughly what some of the issues might be in the area that you're dealing with, and what might be going well with that soil. Hopefully you see some worms or other signs of active biology happening.
Yeah, great. And I feel like different phrases go through different sort of trends as well, right? So, you hear terms like soil biology, soil chemistry, cation exchange capacity. I feel like microbial activity is a big one right now. What are some of the core underlying metrics you're thinking about and looking for when it ultimately sort of comes to plant performance?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's some kind of like key variables that will tell you about, again, this is like in the context of outdoor farming, in mineral soils, where you kind of have to work with what you have. Basically, is that it's a huge area to manage. So a texture analysis is something that's really useful, but that's also something you can gauge, approximately enough to be very informative out in the field. That was like one of the nice things about the soil judging experience. You kind of develop that texture by feel skill that's super helpful. But that in a soil test report, there are also variables that just have a huge impact and tell you a lot about what types of issues you might have in that soil. I think cation exchange capacity is a big one. That's impacted both by the mineralogy of the soil, which isn't something that you really have control over. You just have to, the soil formed the way it formed, and you got to work with what you have. But organic matter is also really important for cation exchange capacity. And, that's something that if you work really hard at it over time, you could make meaningful changes with the right management. But especially if you're comparing like one soil to another, how might fields perform differently, or different areas within a field? Cation exchange capacity is definitely an important variable. And pH is like another one that just has very broad, profound impacts. Yeah. The soil pH will affect what form a lot of other nutrients in the soil are in, whether they're available to plants or not, and also whether some metals might become toxic to plants because it can affect the availability of those.
Cool.
So that would be a few key ones. Organic matter is another important one as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and I like you're keeping it relatively simple, right? So I'm curious, like, where do you think growers tend to overcomplicate soils and soil tests, and where do you think maybe we're oversimplifying things at the other end of the spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, farmers are going to be looking at the nutrient analysis a lot as well, and there's usually sets of fertilizer recommendations to go along with that. Lately, I think there's been a lot of popularity in looking at ratios of nutrients, especially with like calcium and magnesium. And I think there's some like questionable science behind some of that, and you can potentially spend a lot of money trying to correct some of those things. I think that's like one area where they might be overcomplicating. Some people might be overcomplicating a little bit. But yeah, we're lucky in the US. There's like a good set of, at least for row crops, a good set of recommendations to kind of go along with a soil test report and aid in the interpretation of that. And I think it's always super valuable if you have an agronomist who's helping you make management decisions, to have them look at the report, because they'll be able to talk you through like what are some of the specific management issues that you're having, and then are there specific clues on the soil test report that might help you figure out what some of the underlying causes might be. And it's an area where it's very hard to generalize because the local context, and then maybe some of the other observations that you've had of what's happening in your field are super important.
Yeah, yeah. So are you saying just throw all the ratios out the window?
Not necessarily all of the ratios, but I would try to dig in a little bit and see what the basis of some of those are, and also do the math on like how much you'll actually have to spend to correct those, and make sure that there's a clear return on investment that's been documented behind that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then how do you think about carbon content specifically? I think both in an agronomic perspective, but also obviously from a climate perspective.
Yeah, I mean, carbon content or organic matter more generally are another super important variable. And it's one when you're comparing across soils or within different areas of a field, uh, that can also tell you a lot about how soil function might differ. Is it in general, it's a rule of thumb that as your organic matter content increases in a mineral soil, you're going to have more cycling of nutrients, and there's a bigger reservoir of nutrients that are cycling, with help of the biology. And it's also like if you're interested in soil health and you're trying to manage for that, that is like one of the really important variables that you want to try to track over time. So if you're trying to do things like adopt cover crops, reduce your tillage intensity, that would be one of the metrics that you would hope you can see increase over time, and then also increase that capacity to cycle nutrients and make them more available to your crops, in addition to all the other benefits that come with organic matter. So one way of thinking about organic matter is it's kind of both the habitat and the food that drives the microbial engine in soils.
Yeah, great. I love it. As folks are thinking about making changes based on this information and specifically like designing and structuring and running trials, what are some of the frameworks you use? What are some of the recommendations you provide to effectively separate, like what's a good soil trial from a bad soil trial?
Yeah, I mean, one thing is don't jump in headfirst with any new practice or product. Definitely try it out on a small area first. It's kind of like if you have a new cleaning product for furniture or clothes or something, you don't want to just get it all over everything before you know what it's going to do. So start in a small area, and then I think one area that can be a challenge for some farmers, because it is more work, but it's really, really important, is don't just use the product or practice in one field and then try to like look at evaluate how things went at the end of the season. It'll make it really hard to know if the product actually did anything. Where you can really come to more concrete learnings is if you use like a replicated strip trial, where you're alternating between the use and non-use of the product or practice, ideally 4 or 5 times, or whatever your tolerance is, throughout the same field. The issue is there's huge variability in growing conditions year to year. And then also within a field, the soil texture is changing, the landscape might be a little different. You could be on a slope that affects water availability. There's so many things that can vary, and it's very easy if you just do like one strip or an entire field and you're like comparing fields, or just like a single treated strip to untreated, to come to a conclusion about whether the product worked or not, and it might actually be some totally unrelated factor that caused the difference, and the product didn't do anything. If you replicate the treatment and kind of have multiple side by side comparisons between the product or practice, with and without, then that allows you to do a simple analysis where you can separate out underlying variability driven by all the other things, and then what's actually caused by the thing that you're trying to test.
Yeah.
It's a little bit of extra work. It's something, if you work with an agronomist, they can help you set up, but there's also now a lot of online support tools offered from like university extension agencies that help farmers set up these kinds of trials. That'll allow you to really hone in on like, did this have an effect or not, so that you don't have to guess as much.
Yeah, great. I love that. And then, you know, that kind of has me thinking about the difference between sort of the academic and lab scale side and the actual deployments in fields. And I'm just curious, like in your career, you know, what have you learned about the gap between, say, you know, something looking super promising in the lab or at the research scale, and then actually getting it to work in deployment? I know we deal with this all the time, where, you know, we can only learn so much at the lab scale, and it really takes getting it out in the hands of at this point, you know, thousands of growers to understand what actually is working and not working. I'm just curious what you've seen.
Yeah, I think there are like a lot of different components to that question. One is kind of on the technical side of just like the technical challenges that you get from going from a very controlled setting, you know, out into real field conditions. And there's a lot of hardware and software and usability challenges that come with that, and kind of a hardening process that takes a lot of iteration. And like, yeah, the main thing there is, it's like when it works in the lab, you know, you're just like a little part of the way to, you know, getting to the final solution. There's still a lot of work and a lot of things you're going to learn once you start using it in the field. The other big component, and I think this is the one that I've seen companies struggle with more, is kind of more on like the product development side, or like the user experience, a little bit of thinking about how will this technology fit in to the farming ecosystem.
Yeah.
A lot of farmers are working with a lot of different individuals and companies to make decisions. Does the technology, if it's a sensor or model, does it fit cleanly into that workflow, or is it going to be disruptive? The disruptive technologies need to work really, really, really well, because the relationships with all those people that the farmer is working with are important. And unless there's like a really, really obvious value, you usually need to kind of plug in to those relationships, say, develop a tool that supports the agronomist that's working with the farmer by giving them new information. I've been at some companies where maybe you have a new model that makes a recommendation, and it's like, oh yeah, we'll make this recommendation that your agronomist used to make. Well, you know, even if it works well for that one thing, now you've just pissed off a bunch of agronomists. They're not on your side anymore. And it turns out there's still a lot of other management decisions that they need to help make. And, you know, is the farmer going to risk, you know, pushing them out for this like one thing you're helping with? Probably not. So I think that's an area that a lot of companies struggle with. And then also just, it sounds really simple, but making sure that you have a really clear answer to the question of like, are we solving a problem that the farmer cares about? There's a lot of really cool sensors and measurements and models that don't provide super actionable information to a farmer, or aren't trying to solve the right type of problem. And that can happen when you start with the technology in the lab, and then you're trying to find a problem for it to solve, rather than starting with a problem and then finding a solution to it. You can work in reverse order, but you have to be very, very careful, because I think there are a lot of biases that come into play where you think your product's awesome, and there can be some wishful thinking about how useful it is, that can trip up a lot of companies.
Yeah, totally. And you know what you were saying about, you know, connecting the product development cycle specifically to how the end user is going to use that product, I think resonated a lot, right? Like, in the lab, we have, perfect lighting conditions, perfect water conditions, like everything is very dialed and ready to go. And then as soon as it meets the real world, you're in every possible environment you could ever imagine. And people are irrigating differently and, all of the things. So yeah, I completely agree. We have found it's hardened our formulations after years of being in market in ways that we would have never known how to do if we sort of stayed in the lab the whole time.
Yeah, and it can force you to become more targeted in like who your audience is,
Yeah.
or for specific products, where maybe they don't work well for certain crops or in certain environments. Can we develop something that will address those issues directly, and then like for other products, try to take advantage and really give specific recommendations to your customers on where that it will work well. That's true of so many products in agriculture. I think like with the biologicals space is one that's like really blown up, and I think companies getting like super targeted on the problem that they can solve and what conditions their products work is a super important component to being successful.
So you're saying there's not a silver bullet? There aren't just magical products that just work for everyone? Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, I'd love to zoom out a little bit and talk about data specifically, because I know you spent a lot of time thinking about this, but like, it seems like we just have more data than we've ever had possible at our fingertips, and I think that can become overwhelming. And so I'm curious how you help growers walk through the fire hose of data that can come out of their farms and try to make sense of it and try to make actionable changes from that information.
Yeah, I think with any type of data, making sure that you have context on how to interpret it is super important, especially if you're evaluating a new technology. It's good to understand, okay, like how do I get value out of this measurement? And I'll be given a number or like a whole bunch of numbers showing how something changes over time or space or both. Like, how do I interpret those? And yeah, what context will I be given to help me with the interpretation of those? And some examples of like where that's done well. We were talking about soil tests earlier. For common soil tests, there's usually clear set of local recommendations where they can get down to, how many pounds of a given nutrient you should apply based off of the crop you're growing and what the test value is. And there's a lot of testing and research that went behind providing that context. With a lot of on-farm data, it's not going to be that you aren't going to have that explicit of a recommendation. And so the challenge can be like, how do you tease out meaning from a data layer or maybe multiple data layers? And is there anything that you can do in the way that you're collecting the data to help with that? An example would be like with tissue testing for nutrients, like in season, collecting plant tissues. There are some recommendations that will say if you have this concentration of this nutrient, then you have a problem and you should make a foliar application. But for a lot of nutrients, it's not real clear. It depends on when you sample. And so having some sort of relative comparison to get meaning out of the measurement becomes really important. So those types of tests can be very useful if you see a area where crops are very stressed, and then you collect a measurement there, and then in the same field, similar conditions, collect another measurement or a few measurements from a healthy looking area. That could give you a piece of information that helps you understand why is that area underperforming. And you can do similar types of things with, now there's a lot of data that gets collected automatically with the combines and yield monitors. There's satellite imagery, and you can stack all of those data layers together and try to look for patterns. You can go down false paths when you're doing that, because there's a lot of underlying variability that won't be perfectly captured by those layers. And that's where it becomes really important, to have that local context and kind of match your experience of what you see in the field with what you're seeing when you're doing these kinds of, spatial analyses and combining together layers and looking for relative changes. It's like a puzzle, though, and the data can provide you with a lot of extra pieces to try to get a deeper understanding of what may be going on.
Yeah, great. Great. I love that. Okay, cool. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit because I want to hear more about your work at Terradot. So, because I'm super excited about enhanced weathering. I'd love a crash course. What is enhanced weathering? Why is it important? Why are you working on it today? And yeah, what does it look like?
Yeah, the enhanced rock weathering 101 version is enhanced, or rock weathering is actually a natural process that has been hugely important to regulating the Earth's climate for millions of years. And basically what happens is you have rocks that get pushed up to the Earth's crust, and then they're exposed to the elements and rain. And that water actually breaks the chemicals that make up the rock down over time. And that process naturally pulls CO2 out of the atmosphere. And that carbon becomes dissolved in water as bicarbonate that then moves into surface and groundwaters and eventually into the ocean, where it's stable for thousands of years. Eventually on geologic timescales, that carbon will end up going back down into the Earth's core, turn back into rock, and then the cycle repeats. So it's part of a natural cycle. With enhanced rock weathering, what we're trying to do is speed up that process where the rock is breaking down and pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere by getting the rock material, crushing it into a fine powder, which increases the surface area that's exposed to water when it rains, and then spreading it over large land areas. That will help speed up the process. So instead of taking, thousands or millions of years, it can happen in maybe 5 to 10 years. When you do that on agricultural land, you also get all of these co-benefits. Whereas this process, it does consume acidity. So if you're in a low pH soil, it can help increase the soil pH. Calcium and magnesium are released from the minerals that are commonly used for enhanced rock weathering, especially in highly weathered tropical soils. They tend to be deficient in those nutrients, and so that there can be a real agronomic value to those, as well as the silica. These are all silicate minerals that are used for this process. And if you're growing sugarcane, for instance, you can actually see yield improvements from adding extra silica into the system.
Great. And so are farmers taking up this process specifically because it'll improve their soil health and improve their yields, and it sort of has the win-win of over time pulling CO2 out of the air, or are you finding it's still kind of carbon credit backed? Like what are you seeing on the ground today?
There is, especially in like Brazil, there was already some adoption of the minerals that you would use for enhanced rock weathering, just as general remineralizer additives. I would say it's not super widespread, and most of the farmers we've talked with, may have tried it, but for most of them, it's a new thing that they're interested in. And I think that some of the agronomic benefits can be subtle, and if they can take a little bit longer. Like if you have a pH issue, traditionally what a farmer would do is apply a liming agent, and that will very quickly correct the pH issue. Compared to ag lime, the pH effect of the salt, it'll be more subtle and it'll happen, over a little bit of a longer time span. So I think there the benefit is, especially if you can get the material at a discount or for free through an enhanced rock weathering project where the climate benefit is kind of the main incentive driving it, then you're getting these benefits at like very reduced or no cost. And
Yeah.
yeah, so I think like the climate is kind of a key driver, and then you get these agronomic co-benefits as a bonus for farmers.
Cool. All right. Well, I know we're coming up on time here. So I guess my last question for you is just as you think about kind of the next couple of years in this space and the future, like what's getting you really excited? What are some of the technologies or trends that you think will have a meaningful impact on growers over the next couple of years?
I mean, there's more and more attention on soil sensors, and I think people appreciate, especially on the biology side, how complex the soils are. And there's started to be a lot of tech development efforts to figure out how can we get new views into the soil. And it's widely appreciated that the current method of soil testing and making recommendations from those tests, while it's provided huge value, it's also hugely limiting. And there's a lot of improvement to be made. And so, maybe there's not a specific technology that I'm excited about, but I think that there's a bunch of companies in this space, some of which I've worked with and some of my past jobs that are giving new views into the soil and kind of opening up options for how farmers can, I guess, try to accommodate the complexity of soils at scale more easily. That's one thing I'm excited about. And I think that another trend, we have a long ways to go, but in the US, adoption of practices like cover crops, it is increasing. I think it's like a hard time financially for a lot of farmers to be trying out a whole bunch of new stuff, but I think that there's a growing appreciation for the importance of some of those practices for taking care of soils. And I think just with continued education and effort and really innovating both by farmers and also, different people within their support network on like how you actually implement those practices on the ground in specific locales, it'll continue to be really important. And I think that those numbers will continue to go up.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, that's a perfect place to end it. Thanks so much for coming on. It was really fun chatting with you. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah. Thank you, Chad. You too.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrew.